So the new rule is organized into four main sections, but we're actually going to go into them in a different order than they appear on this slide and the actual rule. So we're actually going to start with parts 3 and 4 that you see on the slide, the required data collection activities that are required, and then additional things that the IEP team needs to consider if they are evaluating for a potential emotional behavioral learning disability. So in changing the vague and ambiguous language in the previous rule to specific components of a comprehensive evaluation that must be included, we had a few goals in mind that we've already touched on. But as a reminder, those are to enable teams to make more objective decisions, to minimize the potential impact of implicit and explicit biases on team decisions, especially at vulnerable decision points, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and ensuring multiple specific data sources and methods that provide IEP teams with the ability to determine if the preponderance of evidence documents and supports the identification and the existence of an emotional behavioral disability. This is a really important factor in reducing the extreme racial disproportionality that we have in emotional behavioral disability identifications. So the idea here is teams aren't just looking for a score or a set of scores on standardized behavior checklists, nor are they relying on subjective information or what Dr. Marquita Newell refers to as untrue, unfounded, or unalterable attributions to a child's behavior. So the first requirement you'll see in the rule is the providing, monitoring, and documenting evidence-based positive behavior interventions and monitoring their progress. This gives the IEP team information and data that are critical for determining whether or not a student has an emotional behavioral disability and to identify the student's unique needs. So remembering that data earlier that talked about students with social emotional behavior challenges, they get way less of the good stuff from school and they get way more of the bad stuff. So a student who reaches the point of being evaluated where a team's considering whether or not they have an emotional behavioral disability, this student's likely a kid who's gotten lots of bad stuff from their school experience and needs a lot more of the good stuff that schools offer to sort of change that trajectory that they may be on. A couple of questions that we received in our Google survey about this particular part of the rule. Lots of questions regarding what qualifies as an evidence-based intervention, meaning how long does it have to be implemented for, how many weeks, how many days? How do we know if the interventions being implemented with fidelity? Is there a minimum number of interventions that need to be done? How do we do progress monitoring and things like that? So what we were very cautious about was to not turn this into a very restrictive rule. When it comes to behavior, we were trying to find the balance between requiring interventions, positive interventions to be done, but allowing teams flexibility to individualize interventions for the child who's being evaluated. So hang tight, I have a slide full of resources coming up next that provide information about how to implement interventions, how to determine the evidence base of interventions. One thing I would recommend is starting with something called data-based individualization. That's something, there's a lot of resources on the National Center for Intensive Intervention that you'll see a link to on the next slide. Another question that we got, what if the intervention works? Does that mean that student can't be identified with emotional behavioral disability? Well, the short answer is no. The team does have to implement evidence-based interventions and monitor their progress. You could see a scenario, though, where a team provides an intervention that's directly targeted at one of the characteristics of emotional behavioral disability to the point that the student no longer displays those behaviors at the level of intensity and frequency and duration that might qualify them for special education. So if you already have the right supports in place, the team will need to ask, do we have the right supports and interventions in place without an IEP? That's kind of just sort of RTI or PBIS 101. So here are some resources for looking into evidence-based interventions. There are sort of three main sort of go-to resources for me anyway. Evidence for ESSA, Evidence-Based Intervention Network, that's from the University of Missouri, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which I already mentioned, and the What Works Clearinghouse. So here are some resources for you to dig even deeper into evidence-based interventions. Observations are the most direct information you can obtain about a student when you're doing an evaluation. There's no filter of somebody filling out a form or someone's subjective interpretation about what they see in a student or what they know about a student. There's no sort of language barrier to cause any confusions. Observing what a student's doing is super important because it's the most direct data you have. So what makes observations systematic is that it needs to be objective and obtain reliable and valid results. So there's no specific chart or form. This is going to be an individualized thing depending on several things. So you are going to want to know what you're measuring. So it's focused generally on a target behavior or a few target behaviors. In this case, they are most likely related to the characteristics of emotional behavioral disability that Eva will be mentioning or going over later. You need to know how you're measuring it. So you want to have clear metrics depending on what the behaviors are. So you might be measuring intensity if it's depending on what the behavior is, or frequency, or the rate of a behavior, or how long a behavior lasts. You need to know when, where, and how much you need to measure. So you want to do observations across multiple settings to help identify and determine patterns. And it's also important to remember that you're also looking at ecological factors. You're not just observing with laser focus in on the student, you're observing ecological factors. What's going on in that classroom? What are the antecedents to behavior challenges? What are possible things going on in certain settings that prevent unwanted behaviors from happening? So you want to think about getting a sample of behavior across various modes of instruction, different parts of the curriculum, and in different environments. And you want to know why you're measuring it. You're doing observations to identify student needs, to identify, in behavioral terms, those antecedents and consequences to behaviors, other ecological factors that influence behavior. You're trying to confirm or disconfirm characteristics identified by other sources. So through interviews, you're hearing or standardized rating scales, you might be hearing things about a student that you want to confirm and see if those are environment specific or specific to certain times of day and things like that. So you want to be able to observe and sort of confirm the data that you're getting from other required sources. We did receive a question regarding how do you observe internalizing behaviors? Things like unhappiness, depression, anxiety, and fears. This brings up an important point about why we have all the different required assessments and data requirements in the rule in the first place. And that is that no one activity, whether observation or interview or a standardized rating scale, can give you a definitive answer about student behavior. You need to put all that information together. And some of the requirements in the rule are going to be better tools for answering certain educationally relevant questions than others. So behavior rating scales and interviews, they'll probably give you more valuable information if your educationally relevant question involves internalizing behaviors than maybe observation would. Observation data in this case, again, might be there more to support what you're getting from those other sources by adding to, again, that preponderance of evidence to support something like the characteristic of pervasive unhappiness, depression, or anxiety. So you might see indicators of anxiety that are observable: nail biting, pacing, sweating, quick breathing, things like that. Avoiding certain people, certain places, certain interactions are all sort of observable signs that are indicators of anxiety. So those are sort of what you're looking at in terms of observation for those internalizing behaviors. A couple other things regarding observations. Remember, you are taking into consideration the impact of the instruction, the curriculum, environment. relationships, and other ecological factors on a student's behaviors. If you do really good, thorough observations and get a good sample, you can get your team closer to finding the root cause of behaviors. And it also gives you information on the intensity or frequency and rate and duration, which are critical to determine if the behavior has an adverse effect on the child's educational performance and is appropriate to the context of the environment. All right, the required interviews. I'm going to start off with one of the easier answers from the questions that we received, which was, do we have to interview every single one of the child's teachers? Well, no. Again, you want to think about the required interviews as systematic in much the same way that we just talked about observations. So there's no specific or required list of questions or set of questions that you need to ask. You need to think about knowing what you're going to ask. So again, you're focused on ecological factors as well as the child. You want to know how you're asking it. There are some resources we're going to share in a couple of slides regarding culturally responsive interviewing that are going to be really important to this process. Know who you need to interview to get information on how the student functions across multiple settings to, again, help you determine patterns and take a look at those ecological factors. You want to know why you're asking each of the questions in the interview. So again, identifying student needs, looking at ecological factors that influence the behavior, and again, to sort of confirm or disconfirm characteristics that were identified by other sources, other interviews, or standardized rating scales, or your observations. Know when the best time to interview is. There are some culturally responsive considerations here. For instance, if I have standard rating scale scores before I do the interview, is that going to prime some confirmation bias that I have about a student during a really vulnerable decision point? Or if I have those standard rating scale scores before I interview, am I now better equipped to ask more specific questions to get, again, closer to that root cause of the behaviors that we're seeing? That's going to be a situationally dependent thing and something that just needs to be considered. And then, of course, there's some trauma-sensitive considerations when it comes to interviews. There are, which I'll get into later. So you want to ask yourself, when do I want to do the interview? Do I let the student schedule it? Allow the student to choose where and when we do the interview. When I do the student interview, that's a trauma-sensitive practice that gives the student voice and choice in what's going on in their school day. A little more about interviews, particularly interviews with an LEA staff member who's identified by the student when possible as having a positive or the most positive relationship with the student. So here's a question we received that, what if the student doesn't identify a staff member, or what if no staff member is identified? The problem here is if you're not able to identify a staff member that has any kind of positive relationship with a student, start thinking about what that kid's school day is like. And maybe the concern isn't within the student. Maybe the issue is a climate and culture issue in your school. If you're unable to find one staff member that has a positive relationship with the student. One of the questions was when possible. So is this sort of an optional thing to do? It's not optional. The when possible in the rule, in the statement, refers to the student choosing the staff member. So you may have a young student, a very young student who isn't able to identify a staff member that they have a positive relationship for various reasons, or maybe they just refuse to. Then it becomes the IEP team's responsibility to identify that staff member. But a couple other things. This is, again, a trauma-sensitive practice. It's a layer of protection for the student against potential implicit and explicit biases, against untrue, unfounded, unalterable attributions. Again, the idea of not having a single staff member that has a positive relationship with a student is, well, one, it's heartbreaking Two, it's, I think, incredibly unlikely. And then again, if the student's unable to identify, you have lots of options. The IEP team can identify someone. You could ask the student's parent if there's a certain teacher or staff member that they talk positively about at home. And then when it comes to the requirement being considered and whether, I'm sorry, there was a question about what do we do to ensure that this part of the rule is being followed and that's being implemented with fidelity. Ultimately, this rule is designed to support accurate identification of emotional behavioral disabilities. And, so it really is on the IEP team to put in a good faith effort to identify this person and make sure that you get information from them regarding the student. All right, so I'm guessing some of you are already thinking, how are we ever going to manage a culturally responsive, trauma-sensitive, comprehensive evaluation that considers ecological factors, all while trying to implement and progress monitor an evidence-based positive intervention? So just take a deep breath and remember to keep it simple. Ecological is not some big, scary, nebulous word. It basically means don't just look at the student alone under a microscope. Look at the 10,000 foot view of what's going on around the student. Look at the 5,000 foot view, the 1,000 foot view, and the 500 foot view. You need to look at all the factors that impact the student. And when it comes to the schools sort of piece of that microsystem in the ecological model that you see on the slide here, there you're just taking a close look at the instruction, the curriculum, the environment around the student at the school. And we have a nice little tool, that Riot ISIL model matrix that you see on the left there. So again, the idea with the comprehensive special education evaluation is that you don't have to assess everything, but you don't want to miss anything. So considering what information you need to get a comprehensive picture of the student and the world that they live in. So when it comes to interviews, here are some resources. The interesting thing about interviews is that they're simultaneously probably the most subjective data collection method required by the rule, but they're also perhaps the most important in terms of conducting a culturally responsive evaluation. Who better to learn about a student's culture and norms and values than their parent, than their caregivers, than themselves? So it's really important. So it's the most subjective data collection method. So conducting an interview, it's full of opportunities for biases to influence the decision-making process through sort of attributions that are unfounded, untrue, or unalterable. That makes it a vulnerable decision point when you're doing interviews, particularly with parents and the student themselves. So again, we have those resources about vulnerable decision points and where bias shows up in the special education evaluation process and how to address them. But interviews are also a great opportunity. Every step of the interview, from preparing for it, deciding where, what questions you'll ask, when you're going to do the interview, they're a chance to build a positive collaborative relationship with students and parents, to learn about their family, to learn about their culture and values. And these are no doubt key ecological factors that are going to influence their social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. So this first slide are general resources, not necessarily specific to interviewing. They're more foundational to understand the context and understand implicit and explicit bias and how they impact how we interact with students, both generally and when we're conducting individual evaluations. And this slide has more specific information on interviewing, culturally responsive interviewing, sample questions of culturally responsive interviews within culturally responsive interviews that I would encourage you to take a look at. All right, this is going to be my shortest slide. There's really only a couple of tips for how to do a file review. One is be thorough and detailed. Often students with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges have pretty thick files, and you can really identify some patterns in those files throughout a student's history. For example, Looking at the student's history of office discipline referrals throughout years, and things like that. Looking for patterns in the subjective teacher comments on progress reports can also be helpful. For instance, they might not use the same words, but you can identify things that might be those more durable traits that the student has exhibited over the course of years. For example, a kindergarten teacher might note that this student seems to prefer to work independently, when their first grade teacher says, well, they don't work very well with their peers. Their second grade teacher might say that student plays alone during recess. Well, you can see a pattern of isolation here that you're going to want to investigate further through observation and interviews and other data collection methods. And also that the file review is important because it's likely that you'll get at least some information about the child in all 6 of those areas of academic and functional skill that Eva identified in the comprehensive evaluation process. All right, the standardized rating scales received a lot of questions, so we're going to break it down into smaller parts. But first, I'm going to start with some examples from normative samples. So there are a lot of questions about the normative samples and whether or not they represent the student. So this example is from the Burroughs Mental Measurements Yearbook. Don't worry if you missed that name. I have it linked in a couple of slides. A couple of things to notice here in this review, that this particular tool has no information about geographic location or socioeconomic status. Now, this might be a red flag if you're in a low SES rural area of Wisconsin, because you don't know if this tool is representative of the population you serve or the child that you're evaluating. Another thing to notice here is they clumped together a racial group of other, and it represented 7% of the norming sample. The question here would be, how confident are you that this is an appropriate tool if you're conducting an evaluation with a Native American student? Another example, this one comes directly from one of the gold standard behavior rating scales, right on their publisher's website. I suspect some of you school psychologists, just looking at the acronyms in there, can guess which one this is. But a couple of things to notice. Is 44 states a problem that they didn't include samples from all 50 states, even though they say they considered regions of the country? It looks like they considered a lot of important demographic information and included it in the sample. They balanced it by sex and race and ethnicity, geographic regions, so socioeconomic status, parent education level, rural, urban, suburban populations. So this one to me looks like a pretty representative sample. Important things to remember about standardized rating scales: that no tool out there is going to perfectly match any individual student. The key is that the team gets made aware of the normative sample and that the team discusses the potential implications of that, of what the test was normed on. For you school administrators and district administrators and special education teachers joining us today, don't worry. Your school psychologist is trained to do this. They are trained to look at how tests are designed, their reliability and validity data and all those things, and who the test was normed on, and should be able to help the team sort of wade through and consider what the data from these rating scales means and says about a student. The samples, again, they were from quick Google searches. I will be sharing in a minute a couple of other better resources where you can find real specific normative data on all sorts of different tools. One of the specific questions that we got from our survey, what if the tool doesn't reflect the child's background? Do we still use it? The answer is yes. And again, you need to document it and sort of describe what wasn't representative in the norming sample from the tool. And then make sure the team discusses it and explains the impact of that to be able to scrutinize the data gotten from the source in the context of other data that you've collected. So if you use a tool that doesn't seem really well matched to a student because you weren't able to find one or have one, you need to be able to scrutinize that data in a different way. And again, this is something that school psychologists are trained to do and help guide IEP teams through. And that reminder on the right of the slide there, remember, school psychologists are often the ones who are those IEP team required members who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results. Next part about standardized rating scales. Lots of questions about the two sources in school and from at least one source in the home or community. A student gets referred early in the year over summer and there's no staff members that know the child well enough. What happens if rating scales aren't returned from the home or the community source? What about virtual schools if the student doesn't have any teachers who know the student well enough? The answer to the question of, do we still have to get two sources from school? Yes, unless you can't. So there might be situations where an elementary student only has one teacher, their sort of homeroom teacher, core teacher that knows the student well enough, particularly early in the year where maybe their art and their PE teachers don't know the student well enough because they only see him once a week. Then you need to document that, yes, we only got the data from one teacher and here's why. When it comes to the parent and these other what if questions, the answer is that the information from the parent is that important that there isn't that sort of document why you couldn't get it allowed in this part. So your options here are, you need to problem solve. You have 60 days to complete the evaluation. So a summer referral, if the staff doesn't know the student well enough, give it some time. Maybe you're waiting till later in that 60-day timeline to do those rating scales. For virtual students, did the student recently attend a brick and mortar school? There might be teachers there that know the student well enough to do rating scales. When it comes to parents, do some culturally responsive practices, listen to them, find out what the barriers are and address them. Don't blame the parent and say, and try and understand where they're coming from. I mean, they could be not filling out or returning a form because they're nervous about what the results might say about their child. They might not be able to read and complete the rating scale. They might be too busy or just exhausted from making ends meet to support their family. They might be distrustful of the school or the district because the educational system maybe let them down when they were in school. There's all sorts of reasons. If you read this requirement and jump right to, well, we sent it and we didn't get it back, and that tells us that the parents just don't care, I'm going to refer you back to the recorded videos, webinars, and materials from Dr. Marquita Newell about addressing bias in evaluations and culturally responsive problem solving, because it's simply untrue that there's a parent out there that doesn't care about their kid and their kid's education. And then to remember, it's a source from the home or the community. So, is there a Boys and Girls Club counselor that spends a lot of time with the student? Do they have a soccer coach or a tennis coach or a boy or a Girl Scout troop leader that you could get that data from the community? And as promised, here are some things on the resources where you can get information on the standardization and normative data on standardized rating scales. So every examiner and technical manual for rating scales will have the tools that you need to sort of look at the normative data. A lot of tools have plenty of independent research conducted on them that look at their validity and reliability with different demographic groups. Give the publisher a call or send them an email to their customer service line. They're often more than happy to share their internal data because they spend a lot of money validating and researching their own tools to make sure they're good tools. And then again, the Burroughs Mental Measurement Yearbook is published annually with updated information on new tools, current tools, and it's a great resource as well. You can also purchase and review individual test reviews online, relatively cheap. Uh, and again, ask your school psychologist. These are two of their practice domains that school psychologists are competent in, and they should be able to identify sort of the normative sample and how it represents that individual student. Additional requirement, the team considered the effects of any known history of trauma or mental health disorder. A couple of key points here. One is that the trauma history or mental health diagnosis, it's not there to rule in or rule out whether or not a student has emotional behavioral disabilities. It's more about identifying the disability-related needs. So we know trauma experiences are common, and they're important considerations when conducting emotional behavioral disability evaluations. The team needs to talk about it and consider it. So in these required assessment things, the ones on the left, experiences, you're going to get information on whether or not the student has trauma experiences from things like your interviews and your review of records. And then you're going to be able to assess sort of the level of trauma response from, resilient and really no long-lasting negative impacts to acute negative impacts to more long-standing impacts through all of your other evaluation steps. So the question regarding whether or not, how do we determine the difference between trauma and emotional behavioral disability? I would offer that the response could be the development of, the trauma response could be development into emotional behavioral disability, but it also may not. So recovery typically is the norm from trauma. So a student who has a more adverse reaction to it might be eligible for an emotional behavioral disability. The requirement here is to make sure the IEP team, through its comprehensive evaluation, has assessed potential trauma and the effects of it. I will talk, Eva, I recognize I'm 1 minute over, I'll go fast. This one about considering whether the behaviors are a result of the difference between the norms in the child's family and the community or an emotional behavioral disability. What I want you to do here is sort of flip what you're probably thinking in your head. And that is, this requirement is more about the school and the district's culture than it is about the student or the families and the school and the district's ability to accept cultural differences in students. So you need to ask questions like, if discipline policies and practices are being applied equitably, are rigorous and high expectations in your curriculum and instruction achieving equitable results. These are foundational building blocks that can lead to poor outcomes for children and certainly sort of trigger unwanted behaviors out of students if they're not being challenged appropriately, if they're being unjustly punished in an inequitable system. That this question is more about what your climate and culture is than what the students' culture and norms are. So we were asked for some examples, and I'm going to provide a couple from our two most disproportionately identified racial groups. So we know research has demonstrated that Black boys are perceived as older by teachers, by adults, by others around them. Thus, they lose the benefit of the doubt when they're younger for their misbehaviors, whereas a white 8-year-old might be misbehaving and sort of get a pass because, oh, they're just a little kid, they're not mature yet. Black boys are perceived as older, and thus they should be more responsible for that same behavior at the same age, and we know that's just not true. Black boys are perceived by people as angrier. It's not hard to see how this might lead to disproportionate discipline, and that discipline that might be used to identify a young Black boy as having emotional behavioral disability, when the real problem is people aren't seeing that child for who he is. Another example, the disproportionate identification of our Indigenous students. Think about that through the lens of historical and intergenerational trauma that these students experience and how that impacts their social, emotional, behavioral functioning. They're more vulnerable to symptoms and things like depression and anxiety and things like that. So the question there is, we consider that, is specially designed instruction the answer to that, or are there other mental health supports and services through your multi-level system of support really what that child needs. And I'll just do a quick personal example. When I was practicing as a school psych in a middle school, I was doing a reevaluation of a Black young boy. And thinking about this through the context of Black boys or Black students often being expected to code switch when they come to school to meet sort of that white cultural norm. I worked with this Black student. We were doing an evaluation. He was in 6th grade at the time. I reviewed, did a file review. He had 40, 50 office discipline referrals during his 3rd, 4th, 5th grade year, through his late elementary years. And one of his suspensions was for telling his teacher to get out of here with your country shoes. The student got suspended for that. By the spring of 6th grade, this student in middle school had 2 office discipline referrals. And our reevaluation resulted in a dismissal from special education. I want to emphasize here, these considerations does not mean if a family or a parent or a child tells me that the way their family solves problems is through punching, that we just accept that behavior. Behaviors that get in the way of the student's ability to access, engage, and make progress in the curriculum are things that the school does need to address. So those behaviors that sort of don't meet the purposes of school are still unacceptable and can still be indicative of emotional behavioral disability, but you need to look at it through that cultural lens. And then you have to ask the question, when it comes to hitting, physical aggression, the school has a legitimate educational reason to say that behavior is inappropriate and not acceptable at school, even if it is at home. So what it does mean is that schools and districts and IEP teams need to consider modifying parts of their school that match some aspects of the student's home culture through policy and practice, and then properly teach students and support students when the behavior, again, doesn't meet the purposes of school. Here's a whole bunch of resources. All right, and then finally, this we need to acknowledge that this additional team member isn't a requirement. The rule reads that the LEA may assign this person to the IEP team, but it's not required. Please don't underestimate the importance of this consideration. We highly encourage it. It's because it provides IEP teams, again, with a systematic way to embed trauma-sensitive schools' core values of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment into the evaluation process. It ensures at least one person will be there to sort of monitor and ensure that untrue, unfounded, and unalterable attributions to behavior aren't applied when determining whether or not a student meets criteria. And that this isn't just for students of color. This might be applied or important for students who sort of are pigeonholed or stigmatized because of a sibling who demonstrates similar behavior, or the neighborhood they live in, staff perceptions of their parents. And finally, it's so important because we know students who have adverse reactions to trauma experiences, that the main thing that can change their trajectory is and improve their resilience is having one strong adult relationship that can help that student build positive adaptive responses to adversity.